Hey there, Sally here. I've known Rachel for over 20 years. 20 years of shared birthdays, holidays, and countless hours spent talking about everything, our dreams, our mistakes, our careers. She was always the one I could turn to, the one who listened, who understood. Our families were close too. Her husband Mark and I have been friends since college, and when we both started our families, it felt like the world had come full circle. Kids on the same street, parents helping each other out. It was the kind of friendship you didn't expect to question. I didn't see it coming. We were sitting in the living room of my house, sipping tea like we had on so many afternoons. I remember the way the sun was setting outside, casting a warm glow over everything, making the room feel too comfortable, too safe. Rachel's face, though, there was something in her eyes that made the air heavy. Something was off, but I didn't know what yet. I have to tell you something, she said, her voice unusually quiet. I set my cup down, the porcelain feeling colder than it should have. What's going on? She paused, her fingers twisting around the edge of her cup like she was trying to hold herself together. The silence stretched between us, uncomfortable, thick. I've been seeing someone. She exhaled as if the words had been sitting on her chest for years. For 6 months. I blinked, trying to process what she was saying. What do you mean? Seeing someone? You're married to Mark, Rachel. She looked at me, eyes wide and dark, like a deer caught in headlights. I know. She swallowed hard, as if saying the next part would shatter everything. I've been having an affair with Michael. Michael. Her department head. The one person I'd never have guessed. Mark had always respected him, always spoke highly of him. How? When? She leaned back in her chair, looking down at her hands. It started last year. We went on what was supposed to be a business trip, but it wasn't business, Sally. It was a getaway. A romantic one. A getaway. A romantic one. The pieces started clicking together. The vague explanations, the quiet tension in her marriage, the sudden absences. It all made sense now. I couldn't breathe for a moment, trying to find words, but nothing came. You've been lying to Mark for 6 months? And to me? To all of us? Rachel's face was flushed, guilt twisting her features. I didn't mean for it to happen. I don't know what I was looking for, but I found it with Michael. And now everything's a mess. I stared at her, feeling something inside me snap. My mind screamed at me to run, to shut the door, but I couldn't move. You need to leave, Rachel. What? She seemed shocked, like she didn't expect that response. You need to leave. Now. I can't be here for this. Not like this. She stood up, her voice breaking. Sally, please. No, my voice was firm. I can't. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about Mark, about your kids, about everything I thought I knew about you. I can't do this. Her eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't look at her anymore. I turned away, focusing on the picture of my own family on the mantel. Mark, standing next to me, smiling with our kids. All of it suddenly felt like a lie. Rachel left without another word. I didn't look back as she walked out, my heart pounding in my chest, my thoughts a whirlwind. The security camera, tucked away in the corner of the room, had captured it all, the confession, the raw emotion in her voice, the moment everything between us changed. I never imagined Rachel would betray not just Mark, but me too. We weren't just friends. Our families were intertwined, our lives too closely bound to escape the fallout. This wasn't just an affair, it was a fracture in everything I believed was real. I couldn't sleep that night. The words Rachel had said echoed through my mind, cutting deeper with every replay. 6 months. She'd been lying to Mark, to her family, to me. And for what? A fleeting moment of whatever it was she had with Michael? I couldn't understand it. Couldn't reconcile it with the woman I'd known for 20 years. I rolled over in bed, staring at the ceiling, but sleep wouldn't come. Finally, I sat up and reached for my phone. My mind was racing, but I needed someone to help me make sense of all of this. I called Peter. "Hey," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We need to talk." Peter was my husband, the steady anchor in my life. Where I was reactive, he was calm. Where I was emotional, he was logical. He wasn't just my partner, he was my sounding board, the one person who could always help me see the bigger picture. "What's wrong?" His voice was thick with sleep, but he didn't sound annoyed. That's who he was. He always made time for me, no matter the hour. Rachel. She confessed to an affair. With Michael. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear Peter shifting, probably sitting up in bed. "Jesus," he muttered. "Are you okay?" No, the word slipped out before I could stop it. I wasn't okay. I wasn't sure I ever would be. I'm angry. Furious. She's been lying to Mark for months, and... I know, he interrupted gently. "I'm not surprised, but I get why you're upset." "What are you thinking?" I exhaled, rubbing my forehead. "I want to show Mark. I want to show him the video, the security camera footage. I want him to know exactly what she's been doing, and I want to tell their families. I don't care about the fallout. I just want to expose the truth." Peter's voice grew more serious. "Hold on. We've talked about this before. You can't just rush into things like that. You're hurt. And it's understandable, but we need to think this through." I felt my stomach twist. "What do you mean?" "She's ruined their marriage, Peter. She's ruined everything." "I get it," he said quietly. "But what's going to happen once you show him the footage? What happens when you tell the families? Are you going to be okay with the damage? With what it could do to you, to Mark, to their kids? You have to think about that." The silence stretched between us. I knew he was right. I was furious, but I couldn't act out of sheer emotion. I had to be careful. Mark was a good man. A hardworking, honest man who trusted Rachel completely. He'd never seen this coming. "So, what do you think?" I asked, my voice shaky. "We need to approach this carefully," Peter said. "Expose what's happened, yes, but not all at once. We don't want to create more chaos than is necessary. We can start with Rachel. Have a conversation with her first. Get her to come clean completely before you go any further." A heavy weight settled on my chest. I didn't want to talk to Rachel. I didn't want to hear any more of her excuses or lies. But Peter was right. If I wanted to truly understand what had happened and why, I needed to give her one last chance to explain herself. "Okay," I muttered. "But I want to hear it from her. No more half-truths. No more pretending." "Good," he said. "Take a breath. We'll handle this, but we need to take it one step at a time." I hung up, my mind still spinning. A part of me wanted to storm into Mark's house and confront him with the truth, but another part of me knew Peter was right. I needed to take a step back, cool down, and approach this with a clearer head. The next day, I reached out to Rachel. My message was brief, clipped. I asked her to meet me, in person, so we could talk. I needed to hear everything from her before I made any decisions. The last thing I wanted was to rush into something I couldn't undo. She agreed to meet, but she didn't make it easy. She was apologetic, almost too much so, and I couldn't tell if she was genuinely remorseful or just scared of the consequences. I wanted to slap the pity out of her, but I held it in, reminding myself that I wasn't doing this for me. I was doing it for Mark, for their kids, for the friendship I thought we had. The meeting was set for the next afternoon. I stared at my phone for what felt like hours, unsure of what to say, how to begin. But I knew one thing for sure, I was going to get the truth, whether Rachel was ready to give it to me or not. The next afternoon, I met Rachel at the cafe we used to frequent. The familiar sounds of coffee cups clinking and soft conversations in the background felt out of place today. She sat in the corner, barely looking up as I approached, her posture slumped, her gaze fixed on the table. She wasn't the Rachel I remembered. I didn't waste any time. Why? The question was blunt, filled with disbelief. Why did you do it? Rachel didn't immediately meet my eyes. She stared at her coffee cup, swirling the spoon in slow circles. After a few beats, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to go this far. It was never supposed to get here. I pressed her, not letting it go. But it did. You had an affair with your boss. You've betrayed Mark. You've betrayed everything. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the cup. She looked up then, but her gaze didn't meet mine. At first, it was just something small. A way to feel like I mattered, like I wasn't invisible. Invisible? I couldn't keep the anger out of my voice. Mark gave you everything. He's always been the one who worked. And I had to stop myself, my chest tight with frustration. You just took that for granted. Rachel exhaled, her shoulders sagging. I didn't mean for it to get this big. I've always felt like I was in his shadow. He's always been the one who's successful. He has his career, his whole life figured out. And I was just the wife, the mom. Nothing more. I stared at her, disbelief creeping into me. So, this was your way of making yourself feel important? Rachel nodded slowly, and I hated how she seemed so sure of it. Maybe, she murmured. At first, I thought it would be harmless. Just a way to, I don't know, get ahead in my career. But it turned into something else. I started liking the attention. I started feeling seen. The attention of your boss, I shot back. You used him. For what? Career advancement? I didn't think of it that way, she said, looking down again, almost ashamed but still distant. But, yeah, I guess I did. Michael made me feel noticed. He made me feel like I mattered. The words hit harder than I expected. But at what cost, Rachel? Mark trusted you. He believed in you. And you, I choked on the rest of it. You destroyed everything for this? She didn't answer right away. There was only silence, a silence that stretched long and heavy between us. When she did speak, her voice was barely a whisper. I never meant to hurt him. But I was so tired of being overlooked. Of being the one who didn't get to have her own thing. My promotion, my career, it's all connected to him, to Michael. It was never about Mark. But I think it's about me. My needs. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I stared at her, waiting for any sign of real remorse, but there was none. Did you ever think about what this would do to Mark? To your family? Your kids? I asked, my voice barely steady. Rachel shifted in her seat. I didn't think it would go this far, but when it started, I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to tell Mark, or how to tell myself that I'd done something so wrong. The pain in her voice was there, but it felt detached. I realized that what I was hearing wasn't guilt, but something else. Something that made me sick to my stomach. You didn't think about it at all, did you? I said. You didn't stop and think about what it would do. I was selfish, she admitted quietly. I didn't care enough about anyone else. I stared at her, disgust flooding through me. I couldn't understand how she could be so cold. The Rachel I knew would never have justified this, but the woman sitting in front of me wasn't her anymore. I don't know you anymore, Rachel. She finally looked up, but there was no apology in her eyes, no desperation. Just an emptiness that I couldn't understand. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said, the words low and flat. I wouldn't forgive me either. I can't help you, Rachel, I said quietly, each word heavier than the last. You've made your choices. You have to face them. On your own. The silence stretched between us again. She didn't argue, didn't try to convince me otherwise. She simply nodded, her gaze falling back to the coffee cup in front of her. And that was it. The friendship we'd shared for years, the bond that had been so strong, now lay shattered across the table between us. I stood up, walking away without looking back. It was over. There was nothing left to say. The evening was eerily quiet when I arrived at Mark and Rachel's house. It wasn't like the bustling warmth I remembered, the easy conversations, the laughter. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of what was about to unfold. Mark sat on the couch, a drink in his hand, staring blankly at the TV. Rachel was standing by the window, her back to him, staring out into the darkness. It was clear that nothing was as it once was. I glanced at Rachel. Are you going to tell him? She didn't turn to face me, but I could see her shoulders stiffen. It's time, she said, her voice flat. The tension in the room thickened, but it wasn't enough to stop Rachel from speaking. She walked over to Mark, standing in front of him with an odd calmness. Mark, she began, her voice cool, almost rehearsed, I need to tell you something. Something that's been going on for a while. Mark looked up, his brows furrowing. What do you mean? His voice was still warm, still trusting. He hadn't heard it yet, had no idea what was coming. Rachel took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for the words. I've been having an affair, she said, the words slipping out, cold and calculated. With Michael, my boss. It's been going on for 6 months. The words hit like a slap across the face, even though I wasn't the one they were aimed at. Mark's expression shattered instantly, the confusion and pain overwhelming him. His grip on the glass tightened, and his face drained of color. He didn't speak at first, just stared at her, as if waiting for the punchline, for something that would make this make sense. But there was nothing. No explanation that would fix it. Mark, I'm sorry, Rachel said, her tone never shifting. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. But it did. And I can't keep lying to you anymore. Mark's hand trembled as he set the glass down. How long? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. 6 months, she said, her voice disturbingly steady. His face crumpled, his shoulders slumped, and for a moment, I thought he might collapse. The anger, the hurt, it was written all over him, but there was something else there too. Something deeper. A profound sense of betrayal that seemed to swallow him whole. Rachel stood motionless, her gaze never wavering from him, as if she was watching the fallout she had created, detached from it all. She seemed so cold, so distant from the person I once knew. Mark didn't say anything for a long time. His lips trembled, but his eyes never left hers. Finally, he stood up, his face red with the effort to control his emotions. Get out, he said, his voice low but fierce. Pack your things. Now. Rachel didn't hesitate. She turned without a word, heading upstairs to their bedroom. She returned a few moments later with a bag in hand. Her face was unreadable. She didn't look back as she passed Mark, didn't say another word. It was like she had already closed the door on him in her mind. It was over. I watched as she walked out the door, the click of the lock echoing in the silence she left behind. Mark stood motionless for a moment, and I could see the tears threatening to spill from his eyes. But he didn't let them fall. Instead, he walked to the living room and dropped onto the couch, his face buried in his hands. The sobs finally came, the sound guttural and raw. I left him to it. There wasn't much more I could do. The weight of everything was too much to bear, but I knew I needed to give him space. That night, Mark turned off his location sharing and disappeared from the world. I couldn't blame him for wanting to cut himself off from everything. But he wasn't truly alone. His friends, his family, everyone who cared about him gathered around. They stayed by his side, calling, texting, offering support. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next day, he reached out to a pro bono legal counsel. He wasn't ready to file for divorce yet, not with the weight of it all still sinking in. But he was trying to figure out what his options were. The possibility of reconciliation was there, lingering in his mind, but it felt like a distant dream, something too far out of reach for him to grasp right now. In the quiet of his grief, Mark wasn't sure what came next. All he knew was that his life, the one he had built so carefully, had been shattered by the one person he trusted most. In the aftermath of Rachel's departure, I made the decision to withhold the workplace report for now. The potential divorce implications weighed heavily on me. Reporting her affair could complicate things further, especially if Mark chose to pursue legal action. He had a right to know, but the timing wasn't right. Exposing her now might only escalate the situation, pulling him into a mess he didn't need when he was already drowning in pain. I focused on protecting Mark's interests, trying to navigate the legal complexities he was about to face. His world had been upended, and I knew his next steps had to be handled carefully. He couldn't afford to make rash decisions, even if everything inside him was screaming for retribution. While supporting him, I also knew boundaries had to be set. I couldn't let myself be swept up in the chaos of his emotions. I offered advice, but ultimately, Mark had to make the decisions about his future. I wasn't going to try to dictate what he should do. I'd learned the hard way that loyalty and friendship sometimes meant standing back, letting someone process their grief and rage on their own terms. Rachel's behavior, on the other hand, was more troubling. She had changed, something I couldn't fully put my finger on. The cold detachment during her confession to Mark was only the surface. Her subsequent actions, leaving without an ounce of regret, completely shutting herself off from everyone, suggested deeper issues. I couldn't help but wonder if mental health played a role in her breakdown. The stark contrast between the Rachel I knew and the one who walked out the door that night was unsettling. The impact rippled outward, touching everyone around them. Friends, family, no one was untouched by the fallout. People were forced to take sides, some reluctantly distancing themselves from Rachel, while others rallied around Mark, offering their support. The friendships that had once seemed so solid felt fragile now, as if built on sand instead of trust. I couldn't help but reflect on the lessons that had come from this betrayal. Loyalty, friendship, and moral obligation had been tested in ways I never expected. Rachel's actions had forced us all to confront uncomfortable truths about the people we thought we knew, about the lines we'd draw to protect our loved ones, and about what it meant to stand by someone when everything was falling apart. As time passed, I realized how important it was to handle sensitive information responsibly. In the heat of the moment, it was easy to want to expose the truth, to make Rachel face the consequences of her actions. But sometimes, waiting, allowing things to unfold naturally, was the more prudent course. Mark would make his decisions when he was ready, and I couldn't rush him into anything. Looking back, I could only hope that the lessons learned from this ordeal would help guide all of us in the future. Rachel's affair had shaken the foundation of her marriage, but it had also forced us to re-examine the ways we navigated trust, loyalty, and the responsibility of holding others accountable for their actions. In the end, the greatest resolution was not about revenge or punishment, but about finding peace in the aftermath and learning from the scars left behind.